Hello Story Detectives, and welcome to week 7 of our home learning. Now this week it's actually St Patrick's Day on Tuesday the 17th of March, so in honour of that, because it's an Irish celebration, I thought I would choose an Irish author this week. So I have chosen Oliver Jeffers, who is from Northern Ireland. And this is a book of his called This Moose Belongs to Me. Now, we have done a couple of his books already. We have done When the Crayons Quit, When the Crayons Came Home. We've done The Incredible Book-Eating Boy. I think we might have done another couple of his. I have to check. But he is a fabulous author and he's got some wonderful videos and things on YouTube. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But to start with, let's read the story. This Moose Belongs to Me. Oliver Jeffers. There's the moose. We'll have a go at drawing him or painting him later. Wilfred owned a moose. He hadn't always owned a moose. The moose came to him a while ago and he just knew that it was meant to be his. He thought he would call him Marcel. He began following Marcel, explaining the rules of how to be a good pet. Much of the time it seemed as though the moose wasn't listening, but Wilfred knew he was, mostly because he followed Rule 4 very well, not making too much noise while Wilfred plays his record collection. Sometimes the moose wasn't a very good pet. He generally ignored Rule 7, going whichever way Wilfred wants to go. The moose had a very good sense of direction and Wilfred did not. And because the moose was particularly poor on Rule 7, subsection B, maintaining a certain proximity to home, Wilfred quickly learnt to bring some string along on their outings so he could find his way back again. Sometimes the moose was an excellent pet. He had no trouble at all with Rule 11, providing shelter from the rain, or Rule 16, knocking down things that are out of Wilfred's reach. Good work. One day, as Wilfred discussed their plans for the coming year on a particularly long walk, he made a terrible discovery. Someone else thought she owned the moose. "Rodrigo, you're back!" Wilfred was dumbstruck. This moose was Marcel, not Rodrigo. The old lady was mistaken, and Wilfred thought it only proper that he correct her. "This moose belongs to me," he explained. And to prove it, he called Marcel. "Heel!" But the moose did not respond. He seemed more interested in the old lady. "Good, Rodrigo." Embarrassed and enraged, Wilfred rushed off for home. But in his haste and miles from anywhere, he tripped over his string and got tangled up. And he lay there. Wilfred was beginning to get a little bit worried. It was getting late and the monsters would be out soon. He just ruled out the last of his options when along came the moose and performed Rule 73 brilliantly, rescuing your owner from perilous situations. All was forgiven, and perhaps, Wilfred admitted, he'd never really owned the moose anyway. With that in mind, he and the moose reached a compromise. The moose would agree to all of Wilfred's rules. Whenever it suited him. Dominic, you're back, and you brought me an apple. So there you go. That was This Moose Belongs to Me by Oliver Jeffers. Now, before we go on to the next part, I'm just going to go back through the story and just point out a couple of things about the story that you may not have noticed. So we've got this lovely drawing to start with, and if we watch one of Oliver Jeffers' videos later, he will show us exactly how we can draw that moose ourselves. And I'm not very good at art at all, unfortunately, but I had a go following his instructions, and I thought it turned out quite well. So if I can do it, trust me, you guys can do it. So you have to have a look at that video. I'll explain that later. So here we go. Wilfred's got a moose. Now, a moose, I have to say, is a pretty unusual pet to choose. I mean, most people have cats or dogs or hamsters, but Wilfred's got a moose. Unusual. And he's put a little sign around his antler that says Marcel. He's decided it belongs to him. He's called Marcel. But the moose isn't exactly very cooperative. Basically, Wilfred has all these rules, but the moose doesn't always follow them. However, he is quiet when Wilfred's listening to his record collection. So Wilfred thinks, yeah, I think he understands the rules. But sometimes he doesn't go where he's supposed to go. So Wilfred's got to push him. Doesn't look very happy there. And he's got a very good sense of direction. And he usually stays quite close to home, but sometimes they get lost. So Wilfred takes out that ball of blue string to help him find his way back again. But he's a good moose when there's a rainstorm, because Wilfred uses him to be an umbrella, and he's a shelter. And then the moose can knock apples off the tree that Wilfred can't reach. So he's quite helpful to have around. But then one day they go on this very long trek, and it looks like they've gone down some sort of waterfall in a barrel, which is quite unusual. And then they're sort of trekking on along this countryside, which looks quite mountainous and a bit bleak, actually. We've still got our string there, so we can find the way home. But then we find this old lady who thinks the moose is called Rodrigo. Now, this reminded me of a book that we did last year by Judith Carr called Twinkles, Arthur and Puss. I wonder if you can remember that one. That was a cat who lived in a neighbourhood, and there were three families who all thought the cat belonged to them. One family called it Twinkles, one called it Arthur, one called it Puss, and the cat just went through between the three houses, ate all the food in all the three houses, and each of the owners thought it belonged to them. So that reminded me a little bit of that story. So this lady thinks he's called Rodrigo, and she thinks it belongs to him. She thinks it belongs to her, but there we have Wilfred saying, this moose belongs to me. He's not very happy about that idea. So he calls Marcel and says, heel. That means come here. But of course the old lady's got an apple, so the moose isn't at all interested in heel. He just wants to have the apple. It's quite strange because there's another moose here as well. I don't know what that's all about. Maybe it's just a picture or something. But anyway, there we go. Oh, I see what that is. I've just realised. That's him looking at Wilfred and thinking, should I go to heel? And then thinking, do you know what? No, I'll have an apple instead. I think that's what that means. So he's embarrassed and enraged. He doesn't want the lady to be right and that the moose is actually Rodrigo and not Marcel. So he runs off, but then he gets all tangled up in this string and falls over. And now we've got this lovely picture where it's all blue. So maybe that's telling us not only is it night time, but also that Wilfred is probably feeling very sad, because blue is a colour that we often associate with being sad. And then he's ruled out all his options. So his options, this is a bit confusing. Is a bear going to turn up and release him from the string with an axe? No, that's not happened. or a hammer? Is there going to be a lightning strike? Is a penguin going to appear? Or a saw? Or even a sawfish who might try and rescue him from the string? But none of those things happen. But along comes Marcel. Now the funny thing is, I don't really think Marcel has come to rescue Wilfred. Look, so he's lying there by that apple. And I think Marcel's just thinking, oh, there you go, there's an apple, I'll bend down and eat the apple. And while he does that, he's hooked his antler into the string, but I think that was probably just a coincidence. I don't think he meant to do that. But by coincidence, he's actually managed to rescue Wilfred. So then they go all off home. And if you notice here on the bottom of the picture, the name Marcel has now been torn off and it's not on the string anymore. So maybe that's when it says Wilfred admitted he'd never really owned the moose anyway. That's a good way of showing that, isn't it? That the name is no longer on his antler. Maybe he's accepted that the moose doesn't really belong to anyone, it just belongs to himself. So he doesn't really need to have a name label. Now they reached a compromise, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But the compromise is a bit silly because it says he'll follow the rules whenever it suits him. So basically it just means if the moose feels like doing what Wilfred asks him to do, then he'll do it. And if he doesn't, then he won't. So that's the moose for you. He's not really following Wilfred's rules. But then in the end, we've got this other guy here. And he thinks the moose is called Dominic. Dominic, you're back and you brought me an apple. So obviously this is another character who thinks that maybe he owns the moose. But I think Wilfred has realised that the moose just belongs to himself. Nobody really owns the moose. But there you go, that was the story. Now I'm going to come back on the next video and look at some of the vocabulary in this story because there are some very interesting words. So we'll have a look at the word of the week first and then we'll look at some more of the vocabulary. Okay, I'll see you in video 2. Bye-bye.